Hey, this is Don from Mayleaf, and welcome to another episode of Tea Lifted Conversations. This is our series of informal conversations which we sit and have over tea about a wide variety of topics. Sharing conversations over tea has a unique capacity to expose and hopefully dissolve tribalism and engender free, uninhibited conversation. And I hope that this series provides some interesting viewpoints and ideas which engage, entertain, and inspire you. In today's conversation, I'm chatting with a very old school friend, Sacha Khan, who's a CBT psychotherapist. And I thought I would talk about psychology against the backdrop of the psychological impacts of coronavirus and the global reaction to this virus. Sacha has a master's in cognitive behavioural therapy and has been a practicing CBT psychotherapist for about 20 years. He used to work at the nationally renowned institution called the Priory in the UK and specialises in all aspects of adult mental health, including anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic disorders, and schizophrenia. Sacha has also had training in hypnotherapy and further training in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I hope that you enjoy the conversation. Hey, Sacha, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm fine. Got up early. I had an early start with my daughter, but you know, that's the rules for parenthood, as you know.
Of course, yeah.
You drinking a tea?
I am. I have a cup of Builders in front of me.
I feel very, very sorry for you.
I'm sure you do, yeah. Well, I've run out of all your lovely tea, so this is all I've got left. I'll have to imagine that it's a fancy tea.
Well, I'm drinking a 2020 First Pluck Longjing, one of the rarest teas out there. Sorry, I'm not trying to gloat, but you know, the point here is that these conversations are meant to be a conversation person to person, sharing some pinnacle tea and having a good conversation. But obviously with lockdown, we can't do that at the moment.
That's right.
So I'm afraid you're stuck with your Builder's brew, but I'm sure it'll still stimulate the mind a little bit and hopefully lift this conversation. And what I'd like to talk about with you, Sacha, is talking about the psychological ramifications of fear, of isolation in general, but specifically, of course, related to the current situation that's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic and everybody in lockdown. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, you know, the psychological impacts of this across the globe. I mean, this is what's remarkable, is that this is a global phenomenon. This is something, it's almost an experiment that's happening across the world. It's going to be so fascinating to look back and see all the studies that are going to be generated from this period in history.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So looking at those psychological impacts, and then obviously we'd want to try to turn this into something positive. We want to look at how we can reframe any negative psychological impacts to try to emerge from this with a positive psychology. And I hope that you can even give some practical techniques, albeit short ones, just simple techniques that people could just incorporate into their day-to-day, starting right now, to generate a more positive psychology. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. Plenty to talk about then.
There is certainly a lot to talk about. Let's first talk about the psychological impacts of the pandemic. But, you know, I guess what we're going to be talking about now filters across to all aspects of fear, anxiety, stress, isolation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely right, yes. I mean, the situation is a perfect example of, you know, what we call a trigger in cognitive behavioural therapy. I mean, it would be unusual for anyone to not be experiencing some changes to their internal world, their internal functioning. And yeah, I think anxiety is probably the main emotion we would be wanting to talk about today. Well, anxiety is, psychologists and psychotherapists see that as a negative emotion. So it's seen as being different from fear. So fear is more cognitive, what's happening in our mind, various thoughts, ideas, images we might have. But the anxiety is kind of seen as being the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. So anxiety is more sort of the condition that is created from a state of perpetual fear.
That's right. And so one way of looking at anxiety is that we, as human beings, we're not particularly strong, say, as compared to an elephant. So our skin isn't very thick. We don't have much in the way of claws and teeth. So we tend to be biologically quite skittish, kind of like,
pathetic, thin-skinned animals.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think most of us have seen the TV programs where you see the meerkats, and one of them rears up on its hind legs, and, well, what happens? All of the others do the same thing. So we're also kind of pack animals. We work well together. And so being separated as we are in this lockdown, it really is taking us away from our basic nature. And that can be very, very damaging. Yeah.
Interesting. So you're talking about sort of the meerkats and their sort of signaling techniques. And as humans, as pack animals, we use similar signaling techniques. But since we're isolated from each other, the only signaling that we have is our lovely media, which is throwing 24/7 fear down our throats whenever they possibly can, because it obviously helps their views. And it's interesting here because everybody knows about the placebo response, but maybe less people know about the nocebo response, right? Which is obviously when you are told bad news or you're given fearful information, it's more likely that it's going to result in damage to your health. So if you're told that, an operation is probably not going to go well, then statistics show, and there have been plenty of studies on this, show that, your reaction, your body's reaction is definitely testable. You can see that people have less good outcomes when the bedside manner of the doctor is negative. And I'm interested because it seems to me that we're having now a global 24/7 nocebo response. And I really wonder how different it would have been if we'd reframed the narrative a little bit more with a positive bedside manner, if you like, where the doctors maybe had studied medical NLP and understood the power of words. And as somebody who's a psychotherapist and also trained in hypnotherapy, what are your thoughts regarding that, regarding the way that this pandemic has been portrayed in terms of people's psychological and physical health?
Well, I think it's, as you pointed out, it's in the nature of our mainstream media to sort of promulgate the doom porn, and to because that gets views, that gets ratings. It hooks our, as we described, this tendency towards being a bit skittish, a bit anxious. It kind of amps that up. And then what happens is, well, people click for more of the same. And so it becomes kind of self-perpetuating. In terms of the nocebo effect, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And very much our reality is shaped by our expectations. You were alluding to various studies on the nocebo effect, and it might be useful for our listeners to give an example of that. In a study in which people had back pain, they were asked to do various physio exercises, and there were about 20 people in the study, and they were split into two groups. And in one group, they were told these exercises may cause some pain, and in the other group, they weren't told anything like that. And of course, what happened is, in the group that was primed to be thinking about pain and to be cautious, I suppose, in their movements, that created a painful experience for them. So that's a kind of one example of hundreds. And, of course, we've all heard of a voodoo curse. And in fact, those curses do seem to work in certain countries where the belief system is such that they truly believe that if they have a curse, that they will die, and the expectation brings about the reality. So,
which is so fundamental to CBT, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Of course, absolutely right. And the cognitive therapy, as distinct from cognitive behavioural therapy, cognitive therapy is all about how our view of our world, our interpretation of things shapes our reality. And so if we think we're going to fail, there's no point in trying, well, our world sort of starts to fit our beliefs. And, maybe that's what's happening now with the media. I mean, one of the definitions of anxiety is that as human beings, we tend to overestimate the threat or danger in a particular situation. And we do that in two ways. We overestimate the probability of something bad happening and the severity of it. So something really bad is going to happen, and it's very likely to happen. And then underneath that, we also tend to underestimate our ability to cope in those situations. And I think the media is very much pushing this idea of, really, really bad things are happening. They're going to carry on happening. And, there's no chance of them not happening. And there isn't a great deal of hope, that not many messages about, how one can foster resilience, internal strength and positive messages. Which is it's almost as if the way that things are portrayed in the news is designed to create anxiety and fear.
Right. And so there's an argument to say that the creation of that anxiety and fear is designed in order to make people act in the way that you want them to act. Now, we can talk as much as we want about the motives behind that.
Sure.
But let's assume that it's all benevolent and benign.
Sure.
And that the motives are literally saving the NHS, saving the health service, etc., saving lives, etc. So the idea being that they need to create this sense of fear and anxiety in order to force people to take the medicine that they're being told to take, whatever that be, stay at home.
Yeah, that's right. And, that message, stay at home, save lives, it fits with how you would pattern hypnotic language. It's pithy. You've got the alliteration there. And, it's something that will go into the subconscious and gather energy around it, so to speak. Yeah.
This use of fear and anxiety to gain control, benevolent or subterfuge and conspiracies or whatever you want to talk about, the agendas. Let's put that to aside for a second. There is an argument that they're using it for that purpose. However, if you look at, for example, the Swedish approach, where they seem to have more of an approach where we will give you some information, we'll give you the facts, but you are intelligent, sovereign people, and you need to take enough responsibility for yourself and for your actions, for the wider community, and sort of give a bit of trust to the people rather than sort of force feeding fear in order to get them to do something. Do you see parallels in your treatments, in your sessions, the difference that you get in terms of a result, in terms of empowering people to make their own decisions and have sovereignty over those decisions and sort of giving them facts versus giving them fear in order to get them to do something? I'm just saying that because a lot of doctors, for example, I think are taught that the same technique, right? Which is tell people the scary news in order to get them to either change their lifestyle or take a medicine or whatever it is. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a really good, that's a good question. And I think, maybe some doctors do try to encourage people to act in a certain way by telling them the worst case scenario. But then, as we know, you've had the warnings on cigarette packets for years that, it causes cancer, and you've got those graphic pictures. And what effect does that have on smoking behavior? Well, none. So, if it worked, then I would be doing the same thing with my clients, wouldn't I? I'd be telling them, if you don't do this, your life's going to hell in a handbasket. I think, yes, of course, looking at the worst case scenario, it can be helpful, but you need to look at it objectively, calmly, and to then start thinking it through with compassion and kindness. So when we ask ourselves, the classic cognitive behavioral therapy question is, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? And then if we can envisage dealing with that horrible situation, then we're in a better place, I think. So I routinely work with my clients on exercises where we might consider the worst case scenario. So people who have health anxiety, and obviously that's sometimes exacerbated now, not always though, which is interesting. They'll often say, well, I'm scared that I've got a brain tumor, and they'll go to the doctor, they'll have multiple tests, they don't have anything of the sort. And they're constantly running from this fear of death. So sometimes we have to look death in the face and say, well, okay, let's look at that, and that can be upsetting, but it's empowering. I think, we're often running away from our fear, and that doesn't help. We need to kind of face it head on, whether that's, if we're afraid of cats, we need to get up close and personal with cats and realize that we're stronger than we think. Or if it's death, we need to kind of look at that. If the fear is, well, I'm going to die from some horrible disease or COVID-19. Well, okay, let's think that through. Let's suppose you are going to die next year. What are you going to make of your life in the meantime? How are you going to set things straight? What do you need to do so that if this horrible thing happened, you could feel that you lived more of a rich, full and meaningful life? Yeah.
What's interesting is there seems to be a few responses to a fearful trigger. And one of them is escapism, right? Run away, and that might be turning to sort of alcohol or try to block out the fear through some sort of activity. And I don't know whether or not that works, but I would assume that in many cases it doesn't. Then you've got the second response, which is to allow that fear to somehow sort of, you try and shuffle it away from your mind, but it sort of embeds and becomes this sensation of anxiety, which persists and can cause, a lot of unhappiness and also health problems, as we know. That will, that sort of perpetual state of anxiety will impact your immune system, cause inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. So, it sort of exacerbates, health decline.
Absolutely.
But that seems to me, and maybe I'm generalizing here, but it seems to be the most common response. Is it's sort of like, well, there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just going to sit with it.
Yes.
Almost like sort of bury it, and it will come up now and again, usually at 2 a.m, keep me awake with circular thoughts or whatever it is. And then there's the third side of it, which is, I think, what you're alluding to, which is to just sort of externalize it and say, okay, let's look at this fear. Let's properly assess it, and let's understand it objectively.
Yes.
And also try to experience it, almost live it.
Yes,
so that
absolutely.
You can say, right, is it as bad as you think? And then, of course, in the case of death, that seems quite extreme. But I always sort of, because the fear of death is pervasive, right? And it's probably the sort of common denominator fear that everyone has. But when you start to actually ask silly questions that sound silly but aren't that silly, like, what does it matter if you die? Actually,
sure, yeah.
How it, who does that matter to? If it matters to you, but you're dead and you're no longer here, then what's, I mean, you sort of, you force the actual confrontation of those questions.
Yeah. And I guess, it's looking at what death might mean to different people. And you could ask them, okay, well, imagine you're dying. Okay, talk me through that experience. Not the kind of conversation you want to have at a dinner party, but in therapy, we ask these questions and they do seem a bit strange and silly, but maybe because there's a level of embarrassment in talking about these things.
I think a lot of people have been trained that you don't talk about these things. It's sort of
course,
like
that's right, but we need to, and we don't in our society. We only seem to be kind of talking about death or faced with it when we're going to somebody's funeral. And then all of a sudden it's kind of in your face. And then, as soon as they're in the ground or they've been turned to ash, then we sort of kind of turn away from it and get back to life, which is, I suppose that's one way of doing things, but not all cultures are like that. But just going back to what we were touching on before is, well, what does death mean to you? Is it the death you're afraid of, or is it the dying, for example? And sometimes it's more about pain, people anticipating some slow, drawn out, painful death. But other times it's people might have some latent idea that they're going to hell, for example, or some variant of that, even if they're not religious. Or they might fear total oblivion.
Wow.
Even though intellectually they know that, well, they wouldn't be around to experience that.
Sure.
So, I've worked with plenty of people who profess no faith in a God, but they still fear this idea of, well, what's going to happen afterwards? What if there's nothing? Well, you wouldn't be around to experience that, and they kind of know that intellectually, but that doesn't stop the fear.
So what do you do in that situation? Because that seems like a very difficult one to get around.
Well, I think to meditate on that and to sort of stay with that idea, and what often happens is, as with kind of any stimulation, is we habituate to it.
Okay.
So by habituation, I mean that we get used to it. So it's a bit like jumping into a very cold lake. Initially, it's very bracing, but then the body kind of gets used to it, and that's sometimes what happens with fear. Is you kind of sit with this fear, and then gradually we kind of get used to it, and we get bored with it, and then and then we move on to something else. You see that a lot. I see that a lot when I'm treating people who have phobias. They can be absolutely petrified of spiders and water, heights, and if you encourage them to stay with the fear, to move closer to the feared object, that quite often that anxiety dissipates. They realize there's nothing to be afraid of, and they are kind of bored with it. There's very rarely any surprise or jubilation, right? They just seem to be bored with it. It's not one way of looking at it is, it's not the spiders we're afraid of. It's not the heights. It's not the COVID-19. It's our internal response. So
let's talk about that. Let's talk about, because you're a CBT psychotherapist. So a lot of people may have heard of CBT therapy, but they may not know the sort of foundational sort of approach that CBT has. As a CBT psychotherapist, could you sort of give us the headlines, the dummies version of it?
Sure. Okay. So CBT refers to a few different kinds of therapy, but broadly speaking, we're trying to look at unhelpful patterns of thinking, feeling and behavior. We're trying to identify what those are and to be clear in such a way that we can work out what may be maintaining our problems or making them worse. And then we look at changing things in various ways. We do that in working collaboratively with our clients and trying to, put some of their thoughts on trial, for example. So if people are feeling anxious and they say, well, look, this is going to go wrong, that's going to go wrong, we might kind of examine that, whether or not it's true. So it's really trying to look at, in the first instance, being more realistic in our thinking.
Right.
Because quite often we blow things out of proportion. We see only the negative in a certain situation, or we disqualify positive aspects of our experience. We can be very self-critical. We can be very critical of other people and the world. And it's looking at trying to see if we're doing this habitually and then seeing, well, can we change that?
But this is the key here, is it's about sort of belief systems, right? It's about the way that you interpret external events. The event is not causing a consequence. It has to be interpreted by your thinking, and therefore, if you reframe your thinking, you can achieve more positive consequences. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, and it's not a new idea. And the founders of cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, they do pay tribute to other traditions that are sometimes thousands of years old. So Buddhism, perhaps one of the first examples that really echoed sort of what the Greeks and the Stoic philosophers said later on, that we aren't disturbed by things, but by the view that we have of those things, how we interpret those things. Absolutely, yeah.
And when I first had a session with you when you were still studying, you gave me the very catchy ABC. Do you want to tell people about the ABC?
Yeah, so A is for activating event, and that's the trigger, what happens just before you experience an episode of anxiety or depression, some other negative emotion, or an unhelpful behavior. And triggers could be all kinds of things. Can be real. So, for example, job loss, divorce, bereavement, viral pandemic, or it can be imagined. So, for example, actually imagining oneself as dying from this horrible disease at some point in the future.
Right.
Yeah. And
so then, you can create your own activating event.
Yeah, that's right. So we can, and we do that all the time. That I think it was Montaigne that said, my life has been full of troubles, most of which never happened. So, we're really good at kind of imagining horrible future events and then also dragging up the past and going over that. Okay, so we talked about the A in the ABC, but we're going to go to C, and that'll become obvious in a minute why we're doing that. So C is for consequences, and these can be behaviors, emotions, physical symptoms, all thought processes. And then I just want to talk a little bit about what we call AC thinking, and then we'll get to the B in a minute. So AC thinking sort of connects the activating event with the consequences, and it's very much in the language that we use naturally. So we'll say things like, you're making me angry. So, maybe you're shouting at me, that's the activating event. And then the C there for me is anger, or I'm depressed because I lost my job. So the job loss is the activating event. And then the C, the consequence, is the depressed mood. And what's going on there is we're missing something out, and that's what you were talking about before, which is, well, it's really our interpretation of events, what's happening, whether that's external or internal, that's going to determine perhaps, how I'm thinking, feeling, and behaving. So we probably know this is true because not everybody responds in the same way to the same situation. So why are some people calm when they're facing a job loss? Why are some people less aggressively angry than others? And so part of this model is thinking, well, maybe it's to do with how they're interpreting those events, how they're talking to themselves about those events, the story they're telling themselves about those events. And then if that's true, well, maybe we can help ourselves by learning to come up with a story that's a bit more helpful. And the evidence is that works. If we learn to talk to ourselves in a way that is more supportive, compassionate, that can be really helpful and can really help with all kinds of problems that we have.
Sure. Okay, so let's bring it back to this situation here, right? We've talked about the importance of working on belief systems, way of thinking, of reframing scenarios or activating events to try to emerge with more positive psychology. I'm going to sort of list to you some of the, I would say, negatives of this pandemic, and we can maybe talk about them for a little bit. And then I think it would be nice to move on to what would be the reframing of them. So, for example, obviously, we've talked about it already, the fear and stress of getting ill, right? I mean, this has been hyped to the absolute. I mean, I can't imagine how much higher it can get with all of this 24/7 news, right? This fear and stress, which is going to be embedded in people, even coming out of lockdown, it's going to be embedded in people potentially. Also, the fear and stress that comes from a crashed economy.
Yes,
which is going to be a huge issue moving forwards, and in my view is going to dwarf the impacts of the actual virus itself. Is how is society going to cope with the emotional and psychological effects of a crashed economy, global economy? Then you've got the isolation of lockdown and the loneliness that has, brought about. You've got also relationship issues because, locked 24/7 in a house with your partner or in a broken family or whatever it might be. We know that there's an increase in domestic abuse, potentially an increase in child abuse, and just sort of the arguments and, being locked 24/7 with a partner certainly will reveal a lot about your relationship. So you've got relationship issues coming forwards. I think that also just the fear moving forwards in terms of social closening. Are we going to forever feel that we are somehow being close to someone may lead to contamination? It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts regarding OCD and cleanliness. I guess the hand washers out there are all sort of laughing, going, well, I told you so. But, how are people going to react to social closening? And I heard also that people who have actually had the virus, of which probably there are many people who didn't realize they had, but the people that know about it, a lot of people have been found to have a very sort of low self-image. They feel contaminated. They feel like they can't emerge into society because somehow they've been contaminated with the virus. And then finally, the psychology of what is becoming more of a nanny state or a police state, with the controls regarding lockdown, the controls that have been placed upon us because, rightly or wrongly, again, different discussion, using fear and anxiety as a technique to make sure that we follow the narrative, the psychology behind that, how that's going to affect people in terms of what they think is the new normal in terms of, control and privacy and all of those things. There's so many different psychological elements, and I've just thrown a huge long list at you.
We could
pick and choose. Pick and choose which ones you want to talk about. Okay,
sure. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about any one of those subjects for a long period of time.
Let's talk about OCD hand washing just for a brief. Sure. Because I'm sure you've dealt with a lot of people.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, OCD is very common. About 2% of the population have a obsessive compulsive disorder, and it is a profoundly disabling condition, and can be incredibly draining and time consuming. And contamination OCD, I think, is what you're talking about. So people have an internal sense that even though intellectually they know their hands are clean, they've been washing their hands, for past 5 minutes, it just doesn't feel clean, and they need to keep doing it. And so their brain is kind of locked, and very, very damaging, disabling condition. But as you mentioned, you said, well, maybe they feel vindicated now people are washing their hands. But, probably not, because, they can see the fantastical nature of their own problem. They're often painfully aware of the fact that it's irrational, but that doesn't help, and it highlights how we're not really rational beings. We're emotional beings predominantly, and this is a good example of that.
But do you think that the fact that now everyone's talking about contamination and contactless, et cetera, do you think that is going to generate a whole new wave of people out there who develop this sort of OCD or obsessive cleanliness, or do you think that is just a natural artifact or of certain people, and it's not going to increase or decrease according to this situation?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I would imagine for younger people that only kind of under children on the age of 10, for example, if they're going shopping with their parents and they see other people behaving in this way, then that's bound to have an impact.
Right.
And if they're already of tender conscience, people with OCD are said to be of tender conscience, so they're sensitive people, then that may impact them. That might be what we call a critical incident. And people kind of see everyone behaving in this very, very cautious fashion. That could certainly impact them and maybe make them more prone to, for example, OCD. Yeah,
this is what I mean. It's going to be so fascinating to see the effects of this moment in history in 20 years' time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I was interested by the language you were using because you were talking about socializing. But then you were using this word closening, which I'd never heard before. And I thought, wow, we're really having to come up with new words for what's going on. And perhaps we shouldn't be doing that. Perhaps we should be reinforcing the old words and just call it socializing rather than closening. I don't know what you think about that. I don't mean to be disparaging.
No, I agree. No, absolutely. I think that it's the sort of elastic band thing, it's sort of like we're being stretched apart with this term social distancing, that just going back to socializing is going to feel like social closening. Do you know what I mean? Like
absolutely.
Just being able to stand within 2 meters of somebody, within a meter, being able to hug somebody, shake hands with a stranger. I wonder how quickly we will fall back into that, or if we're forever going to be changed as a society in terms of our socializing behavior. And it would be interesting to sort of see what kind of, how that changes the whole psychology of society, the way we behave.
Well, I think as human beings, we do have, as you pointed out, this need for social contact. And I think maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think that'll win out, that we'll realize we do need to shake hands with people. We do need to look them in the eye. We do need to not be afraid of getting contaminated by them, because that's, it's not good for us, and it's going to lead to a fear that's worse than the disease, I think. I kind of hold out hope for humanity.
So do I. This is all about trying to, as you say, face all of these things and look at them and see just expose them, because the people need to understand that it's going to be weird, right? It is going to be strange when going to a club or going to a pub or going to a bar, it's gonna feel different, and we need to address that. Just leaving the house, right? For a lot of people, let's talk about that. Let's talk about isolation and loneliness, and how that may be affecting people.
Yeah, I think old people who've been, strongly encouraged to really isolate, I do really fear for their health and safety, because they're not having any kind of physical contact. And well, we know that if you have a dog or a cat and you don't give it any physical contact, well, kind of gets really sick and dies. And so we know from
many studies, isn't it? There's been many studies regarding longevity and the centennials and all the rest of it. Yeah. You lose social contact is it's probably I've heard that it is the number one sort of contributory factor to early decline of health and death is in elderly is lack of social contact.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I'm not too sure about the stats. I'd have to check it out. But yeah, some sources say, well, it's like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So yeah, can be absolutely devastating. And I guess that's a question that will be asked with the benefit of hindsight. Did we need to engage in the level of social distancing that we did? And I think the jury's still out with that, as it is on many things. But we've been living with viruses since, for as long as we've existed. And I believe that the body contains trillions of viruses within it. So, perhaps we should be looking at things from that angle. Yeah,
I think that there is a sort of general, and it is very general, feeling of there's us and then there's the pathogen. I think that a lot of people are less sort of aware of viruses and the fact that we have, as you say, trillions of viruses circulating in us regularly. And from listening to the media, you would have thought that we are virus free, and this one little virus getting in us is going to be the death knell for us. But one thing that we certainly can do is, as you say, frame it in the context of history. We have been dealing with viruses as a civilization, as a human population for thousands and thousands of years. And of course, there have been very bad pandemics and a lot of people have died. I'm not, suggesting otherwise. But, we do need to adapt to it. And I think that it's unfortunate that the narrative, going back to the psychology side of it, the narrative which is being portrayed by the media is very little about, as you termed it before, like actually looking at the fear in the right context, looking at it in the context of other illnesses and in the context of other diseases, in the context of history, looking at these, also the sort of manipulation or the use of statistics and figures. We know any statistician will tell you that you can make numbers look in many different ways, right? Depending on how you frame it and, what parameters you use. But sort of just generally looking at all of these things with a mindset of we want to make sure that the psychology of the population is being impacted in a way that is going to help them move forwards rather than paralyze them. So let's talk about that. What would be the reframing here that you would use for various different issues that we talked about in order to allow people to emerge with more positive psychology and not even emerge, but right now deal with the emotions and the negative psychology that they may be dealing with now?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously, I mostly work with individuals. And so it would be trying to work out where you're at the moment. Because, if you're very depressed or you are being assailed with something like OCD, then it's really about addressing that and kind of, really trying to see if you can ameliorate that unnecessary suffering. So trying to put a positive frame on things if we're at -5 is probably not the best thing to do, try and do. And it's all about trying to survive and addressing that. But how, if we're not sort of hugely panicked, anxious, angered, depressed about this, there's plenty of things we can do. And, hundreds of suggestions I could give you. I mean, the first thing to do would be to try and think about the possibility of something good coming from this, and just seeing if you can spend time with that question and think about, well, yeah, is there anything good that can come out of this? Am I capable of doing something in a different way? Is there something that I can appreciate a bit more in my life? Because I think we've all had a lot of time to kind of contemplate our navel, so to speak. But, a lot of people have been talking about really appreciating the fact that the sun's been shining, that they can see the birds in the trees, and just kind of feeling more in touch with nature, I think, which has been flourishing since we've had this lockdown. So that would be something to try and cultivate, I suppose, is an appreciation of nature and our part in the universe.
Yes.
Yeah. So kind of looking up at the stars and feeling thankful for being alive, even though we're going through a very difficult time.
Well, I mean, it's certainly something that we have seen before, isn't it? When you are faced with an imminent threat, or when you're faced with danger, it sort of puts into focus the value of your life, the value of what you have.
Yes.
And especially, I would guess that is amplified when it is a community, when you're sharing that with a community, let alone sharing that with the world.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is certainly a positive reframing there, which is we are having a shared experience. People talk about how people were happy during the Blitz, for example, right? Because there was this shared experience, a shared enemy, I would say. But also, I think more important than that is just a shared experience of going through something together. Now, of course, with lockdown, that is affected. Is not going to be in the same way as it was in the Blitz, but we've got Zoom now, so we can have our Zoom sharing moments with friends and family, and I think a lot of people are starting to reach out to friends that they maybe have not reached out to previously, and value things that they potentially weren't valuing before because of the fact of this threat and this sense of danger. Absolutely, I think that's a key element of positive reframing. Any other techniques that you could recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think people all have some sense that breathing in certain ways is going to be helpful. But I remember teaching groups on anxiety, and I'd ask people in the group, sometimes it'd be, 15 people in the group. I'd say, well, what do you think might be helpful that you could do for your anxiety? And write stuff down on the whiteboard. And they'd all say, breathing, deep breathing, meditation, that kind of thing. And I'd say, okay, that's interesting. How many of you in this room actually practice deep breathing? And almost always no hands went up. And this, I did groups for years. So it's really interesting. We all like to sort of talk about things without actually doing them. So really, really, really do this. Start breathing in a rhythmic, even way through the nose if you can. And just
in and out through the nose, so both ways? Okay.
Keeping the mouth closed. Put the tongue to the roof of the mouth, just touching the back of your top teeth, because that tends to stop what we call sub-vocalizations. We're a society that's based around, chatter and talking. We say, this person's got a really, really good mind, but what we're saying is they've got a good mouth often. So, this is an opportunity to shut that part of the brain down, because that's not really where the solutions are coming from. Yeah, so Einstein famously said, well, you can't solve a problem at the level of thinking that created it. And we're always chattering and talking. And so, and you know, our anxiety is fueled by kind of chatter and internal dialogue. So shut the mouth, put the tongue to the roof of the mouth, find your natural rhythm, and then just tune in. Notice how that starts to modify your physical sensations, which it will do. Breathing is very powerful. Many techniques.
Incredible,
you
yeah.
can do. And then if you want to do a deeper dive on that, what you can do is something called box breathing. Very simple. It just means that you're going to breathe in, let's say to a count of 4. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, 4, holding that for a count of 4, 2, 3, 4, and then breathing out, 2, 3, 4, and then holding it, just holding there for 4, and then repeating that pattern. Very simple. So 4 sides to that box. So that's something to try. Do it every day for a couple of minutes. Make an agreement with yourself. Say, look, every day after I've brushed my teeth, or I've had my tea or my coffee in the morning, or I've spoken to my friend on the phone, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do that for 2 minutes. And then when you've completed that, irrespective of the outcome of that, say, well done, I did that. Well, it sounds a bit strange, but that's a way of locking in habits.
What is not just doing it, but congratulating yourself for doing it?
Well, yeah. So having a prompt, so doing it immediately after an already established habit. So, if you brush your teeth twice a day, well, you can stack another habit on a new behavior on top of that. So you've got that, you have that prompt there. Also, we're going to make it manageable. So that's why I said 2 minutes, not 25 minutes. Yeah. So it's pretty achievable. You've got a high degree of the possibility of success there. And then the celebration afterwards is, well, that's about positive emotion, because real change in behavior happens when we're feeling good about it. Yeah.
Just repeat that sentence, because I think it's very important that every listener hears it.
Real change in behavior happens when we're feeling good about it.
I think that is the most important thing here, because there's so much negativity going around. And when you're feeling positive about things, you will make the changes. That fundamentally important.
Absolutely, yeah. So there is a little bit of the fake it till you make it in this, because maybe afterwards we don't feel good about it, and the mind's got all kinds of things to say about it. And, here we go with the negative interpretations, well, anyone could do that. Oh, this isn't going to help me. What's the point in doing this? I can't be bothered. I'd rather do this, or any number of kind of negative, disapproving, judgmental, self-blaming things that we might have going on in our minds, But that's okay. Allow those thoughts to be there. Can't always change those. But have the celebration anyway. Sounds silly, but, suck it and see. Do that for a week or two, and you may be surprised.
It's unbelievable, as you say, how much of a hack breathing is to your whole physiology. It's incredible. We all know it. We all talk about it. It's free. It's simple. It's easy. You can do it absolutely anywhere without anybody even knowing you're doing it. And yet we, even myself, I don't do it enough. So
Don't blame yourselves for not doing these things, because that's in the nature of being human. We're built for survival, not happiness. So we're inclined towards, eating food if it's in front of us, because, biologically part of our mind doesn't know that we're not going to starve. Yeah. And we're not built for, doing the things that are best for us. But that's okay. So let's make this process manageable by doing, 2 minutes of something here, 2 minutes of something there. After I've done this, an already established habit, brushing my teeth, going to the bathroom, I'll do something else, new behavior, 2 press-ups, or, I don't know, whatever behavior you want to change, eat.
Well, I think it's actually an important thing, and I'll add one in here as well, which is how many people are leading a very sedentary lifestyle at the moment, stuck indoors, feeling like they're sort of legitimized or justified sort of laziness in a way. And I think just doing some exercise, I'll throw that in, I think is a very, very, and we all know the benefits of exercise. So, I mean, we don't have to go
Absolutely.
on about that.
And, make some incremental changes, and if you are being a bit of a couch potato, you're having too many cakes or drinking that extra glass of wine, that's human, we're going through a very unusual situation. So again, don't beat yourself up, but just see if you can kind of, just open the door a little bit by trying, some of the things we're talking about here.
Okay, so we talked about having a moment with yourself to ask the question and allow your mind to enjoy the process of thinking about what positives can come out of this situation and the value of things that maybe are being revealed to you. Secondly, you're talking about breathing techniques. Third thing we're talking about is just general sort of, I would say, lifestyle things that you forget because you're boxed into your own head, but like exercise, getting some fresh air, being a bit, healthier in terms of your diet, getting some sunlight, those kinds of things. Just we'll throw that under the term sort of general lifestyle, habits. Anything else? You talked about meditation before. Is that something that you want to talk about a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, meditation is great, but the problem is that the people that would most benefit from it really struggle with it. They can't do it or they don't want to do it. So again, I would say if you want to meditate, well, start slow and start with 5 minutes, and then lock that in the same way we talked about the breathing. So,
and what would you recommend? Because a lot of people ask me this, how would I start meditating? Some people say focus on the breath. Some people say become just an observer, a non-judgmental observer. It doesn't matter, what you're thinking or seeing or hearing.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Look, the breathing is always there, so that's a good thing to start with. And in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and which is based on the Vipassana tradition, it's mostly about noticing the feeling of breathing, and that's something to do. If you really struggle with that, well, yoga's meditation too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can do some movement, and there's plenty of videos online for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to be putting some stuff on my website at some point.
Okay, cool. By the way, everybody who's listening, I'll make sure that Sacha's details are in the description of wherever you're listening to this, so that you can reach out to him and see what he's putting out in terms of his website as well. Okay, so meditation, breathing, some good lifestyle choices. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to go run a marathon, but just sort of some added elements just to your lifestyle. And then positive reframing of the situation.
Absolutely. Asking yourself some sensible questions and giving yourself time to answer them, maybe writing them down, asking, well, look, is this really all bad? Is there anything good that can come from this? What can I do today that might be a little bit different so that tomorrow I can look back and I'll feel good about that? I'm just trying to think of there's so many questions we could ask ourselves.
So seeing progression, because I think a lot of people are feeling, I guess, in this lockdown that every day is just bleeding into the next, and they've sort of lost all sense of time and purpose, etc. So just sort of giving yourself little activities that you can look back on the next day.
Absolutely, yeah. And make time for quality time with family members and friends, so you may be living in, cheek by jowl with your family, but try to have quality time. So, well, at this time, we're going to do this together, or we're going to make a nice dinner, we're going to set the table and, really share that experience. So make an occasion of things.
Yeah, create events. Bookmarks.
Absolutely, yeah. And also something else we haven't talked about is, maintain good humor.
Yeah.
And, share those memes and laugh and joke about things, be a bit ridiculous.
Fundamental to that means being very careful about how much news you watch, I would guess, right?
Well, yeah, I would suggest in some cases, for some people, turning it off altogether, going on a media fast. It's amazing the benefits that can have for people who are really quite unwell, and also for people who are high functioning. If they stop watching the news, they start to feel a lot better. They feel freer. They feel more in control. They're more able to take responsibility.
Or at least scheduling it, if you're not going to go on a complete fast, then say, right, these are my channels of choice.
Yes.
And choose wisely, people. But these are my channels of choice, and I'm going to watch the news at these 2 times in the day for no more than half an hour or something. That way, if you feel you want to keep up to date with what's going on, you can, but you don't have to feel like it's. I think that the key here is active versus passive. I feel like so many people are being sort of narrated to, and they're just sort of, addicted to, the latest headline that pops up on your phone or whatever it might be. And they're passively receiving as opposed to, actively sort of seeking out the information that you want to seek out and then distancing yourself from it.
It's taking back control, assuming responsibility, and it's asking yourself, look, who's running your life? Is it Google, Facebook, and the BBC, or is it you? So, if you're not controlling the show, someone else is going to do that. And then they're going to do that with their own agenda, whatever that is, selling newspapers, selling stories.
Sure. Okay, well, there's plenty to get our teeth into there. I think that I read you that very long list before of things that I was thinking could be the negative psychological impact. So just sort of reframing them myself, like we talked about the fear and stress of illness. Well, I think that we talked about it is that can be reframed into an understanding of the importance and value of your life.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of hacks, if we're feeling, very afraid of death and dying, well, maybe that's because we're really concerned about health and healing.
Exactly.
And then we can start to build healthy beliefs. It's like, well, if I'm so frightened of dying, it's probably because I care about health and healing and becoming stronger, being more resilient. And then we can start to build thinking around that and change the focus. And that's not being avoidant, it's constructive. Because, if you think, well, hold on a second, I'm petrified of dying. It's like, well, let's focus on what I can do about my health. Maybe I need to go in the garden and get some vitamin D. Maybe I do need to start doing more gardening and start, drinking more water and practicing, gratitude. Well, that's a great thing to do for negative emotions.
Yeah. Sure.
Being, practicing the feeling of gratitude, and keep a gratitude diary and start to write in that every night, just 3 things that you're grateful for.
Absolutely. I think everything here is take the flip side of the coin, right? The flip side of the coin of the fear and stress of illness is the value of health. Similarly, the flip side to maybe the fear and stress regarding economy is sort of a recognition of the fact that, money doesn't rule your life, and that you maybe will start to look at your finances and your economy in a slightly different way. You might change your life's course a little bit. You may start to say, well, you know what, I want to do things that bring more meaning to my life, or you might change your sort of job role, or you may relinquish that anxiety that comes from being part of the rat race.
Absolutely,
right? So,
yeah. And of course, unfortunately, many people are going to lose their jobs, and that's tragedy. But it's trying as much as we can to think constructively, well, what else might I be able to do?
It's going to be really interesting to see how many people take this opportunity to develop a different career path.
Absolutely.
Or develop, I wonder if there's going to be a sort of flourishing of creativity that comes out of
certainly
out of this environment.
I think there is already. I think being kind of locked up, so to speak, has given people that opportunity. And if you feel that you can make space for that, then certainly do that. And if you're a creative person, then, I think it's very important to have that outlet, So if you've, for whatever reason, stopped drawing or painting or playing music, you may want to ask, well, why did you stop doing that, or what's stopping you from starting again?
Absolutely. And then the flip side of the isolation and the loneliness is hopefully cultivating a sense of enjoying your own company.
Absolutely.
Cultivating a sense of self-sufficiency, of maybe sort of facing those sort of the chatter in your head and sort of looking at it non-judgmentally and allowing it to expose, this sort of these ways that you make yourself unhappy and therefore hopefully enjoy being by yourself a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I can't remember who said that most of our problems come from being unable to spend even half an hour on our own with our eyes closed. I think there's a great deal of truth to that. I think, we were talking about meditation earlier, and I think, people do struggle with that process often because there's some expectation that they're going to feel immediately calm, or that their mind should be clear, and, they should be experiencing certain positive things very quickly. And of course that doesn't happen, because when we sit down or lie down with our eyes shut, then we're exposed to all of our internal demons and all of our personal painful history and all of those nasty imagined futures. And so really, meditation is really quite bring up a lot of negative emotions, but that's for the good, that's for the good. If we can face that, then we're not running away from ourselves anymore. We're moving towards it. And as we know in this discussion, we've always been talking about moving towards our fear, moving towards the feared object. And if we move towards ourselves, then maybe we can shake hands with ourselves for the first time.
Sure. And similarly, I mean, we're talking about, the issues with relationships, and obviously I'm very worried about, all of the abusive relationships out there and the ramifications. But, I guess a positive reframing is recognizing bad relationships. A lot of times we sort of are in relationships which may not be healthy for us, but because of our day-to-day, because of all of the distractions, because we're able to sort of go to our work, we sort of don't face them to either realize that they should be things to be walking away from, or obviously even better, to resolve issues and talk things through and try to foster closer relationships.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, again, it's moving towards the pain, isn't it? That with jobs and busy lives, it's very easy to avoid, say, confrontation or discussion about things that might not be right in relationships. But maybe this is a time to make some space for speaking, asking clearly about from those we care about, those we love, asking what we need, what we want, and then allowing them to answer those same questions. What do they want? And then listening to that and saying, well, can you negotiate some reasonable outcome there? Because all good relationships are about negotiation, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a whole other conversation, but the perpetuation of the idea of some sort of Hollywood romantic, endless, eternal love that doesn't require any sort of negotiation or doesn't require a transformation into a more collaborative, and it may sound less sexy, but more sort of companionative. Is that a word? Companiative? I don't know if that's a word. Anyway, it's a fascinating subject, and I think the cause of a lot of unhappy relationships is this clinging on to this idea that some sort of passionate love relationship should never ever change from its sort of haloed, first year. It's a weird thing that we have embedded in us.
Well, yeah, it's there's so much in our society and culture, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Moving on to the fear of social closening, as I put it, the flip side of this fear of contamination, I think, is clear. As you said it before, I think that we need to recognize the importance of human contact, the importance of spending valuable time with friends and family. Which, while social media, Zoom, Skype has done amazing things, you cannot replace, sharing space. I just don't think you can replace it. And I think that hopefully people are going to recognize that, maybe put down their phones a little bit more and spend more valuable, real time, physical time with friends and family coming out of this.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think there's plenty of opportunity for developing new ways in which to interact with people, or to being really present. And I think, I would imagine the initial effect of being kind of released from this lockdown will be that being with other people is going to be very novel. But I think it's potentially an opportunity to do those things you suggested. Hopefully we can get on trains and tubes and look at each other without staring into our devices. Yeah,
absolutely. I hope that there's going to be a rebound effect, and that we really are going to sort of embrace the importance of human. We are pack animals. Being with each other and socializing and shaking hands and hugging, and I wonder if there's going to be a baby boom after this.
Yeah, well, it's quite possible, isn't it? Yeah, of course, at the best of time, it's hard trying to keep young people apart. So who knows what's gonna happen?
You heard about all these secret clubs that are like in Berlin.
Oh, really? Okay.
They're trying to shut down clubs. Yeah, people are reacting like they need to go clubbing. They need to socialize. They need to. Yeah, it's a interesting reaction.
Yeah.
And finally, the psychology of the police nanny state, which is obviously a huge discussion. But this idea that we are being conditioned into accepting civil liberties being taken away, even if temporarily, and even if it's for good reason. I think that the flip side of this psychology, which is being generated globally, that's coming from this media barrage of government's pithy lines and all of this sort of this, as you say, sort of almost hypnotherapy, which is happening. I think that what needs to, the flip side of it, the positive reframing of it, should be exposing the fact that there is a narrative here. And you can agree with the narrative or you can disagree with the narrative. That's really almost beside the point, but it's exposing the fact that there is no real objectivity here, that everything is subjective, and that there are elements of control over that narrative across all walks, from medical science to politics to media.
Yeah, just looking at it from the perspective of individual therapy, when I work with clients who are really sort of up in arms about the things you've been talking about, I would, again, encourage them to adopt a position of personal responsibility, that they don't necessarily need to tune into these things. If they do, they decide when and where they're going to do that. And then also, getting them to take things less seriously. Okay, it's on the news. That doesn't mean it's true. That kind of thing, and encouraging them to come to their own ideas of what's right, or what's I wouldn't use the word true, because, as you said, everything's so up in the air at the moment.
And even when it's not, truth in itself, it all depends on perspective, right? Where you're standing, the same object looks different from different positions.
Absolutely right.
And trying to define the fact of that thing is a very slippery slope, and claiming that there is one way of looking at something is also a very slippery slope. And I think that you're right. It's about taking back sovereignty over your own ideas, how you disseminate and accept information, and your mental and physical health.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely right. Yeah.
So we've managed to get into quite a few subjects here. Thank you so much, Sacha.
My pleasure. It's a deep rabbit hole, isn't it?
Oh, there's plenty we can talk about. And obviously, any listeners out there, if you want more conversations with Sacha, then please do let us know, and we'll arrange something. Sacha is an old school buddy friend of mine, so we can sit and chat for hours upon hours upon hours about all sorts of subjects. But I think that we've managed to cover a fair amount today. And I'm sure you've got plenty of clients that you need to see. But thank you so much, Sacha, for taking part. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Happy to come back anytime. Thanks so much.
And as I said, I'll put Sacha's information down in the description of wherever you are listening to this recording. And you can reach out to Sacha if you've got any questions yourself.
Yeah.
All right, Sacha.
Happy to help.
I'm going to get on with my day. Have a great day. And I guess I need to send you some tea if you're sipping on tea bags over there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this. What were you drinking?
I was drinking a 2020 First Pluck Long Jing, which is a green tea, but it's the first pluck of the season. So it's pretty special.
Okay, yeah. I love me some First Pluck. Let's have some of that.
I'll hit you up with some First Pluck. I'll stick some in the post for you.
All right. Cheers.
All right, man. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye.
See ya. Bye. Bye.